What family secret was finally spilled in your family? Story 1. Grandpa was a treasure trove of stories and secrets. During Prohibition, he smuggled moonshine across the border from Mexico and distributed it throughout the country. In the 1920s and 1930s, he also smuggled people across the border by pretending they were his children, siblings, nephews, whatever worked at the time. During World War II, he joined the military under the promise of money and U.S. citizenship. When they asked who he was married to, he claimed my grandmother, so she received all his benefits. After he passed away, we discovered they weren't actually married until around 1952. We also found out he had been married in Mexico and had children there, but he never kept in touch with them. He told the military he was married to my grandmother for 2 reasons. First, so she could receive his benefits, and second, because her mother was a devout Catholic who would have been furious if she found out her daughter had a child out of wedlock or was living with a man unmarried. At one point, according to my father, a man called asking to speak to my grandfather, claiming to be his son from Mexico. My grandfather told him never to call again and hung up. We also learned he had helped liberate a concentration camp during the war, something he never spoke about. There was one thing we never figured out. When I was in grade school, I had to ask my grandparents about our family history for a project. My grandmother shared a little about her background, but refused to talk about her father. She only briefly mentioned her mother and said she was born in Texas. My grandfather, on the other hand, completely refused to talk about his family. He wouldn't tell us if he had siblings or even his parents' names. When we asked about our last name, he simply said, "Doesn't matter." Looking through his old military and border crossing records, we discovered that he had changed his last name a few times, so we aren't even sure if the one we know is actually his real name. To this day, the family has no record of his parents or siblings. My grandmother once mentioned that he had a brother before she passed away, but that's all we know. We do know he was born in Sinaloa, Mexico, around 1915, at least that's what he confirmed. However, some records list his birth year as 1916 or 1917, nothing else. Story 2. When my grandma passed away, she left behind a bunch of letters confessing all sorts of shocking things. My dad was actually the result of an affair, and she never told her husband or my dad that they weren't biologically father and son. When my dad was young, one of their houses burned down. His teenage brother, who had come home instead of staying over at a friend's, died in the fire because no one realized he was inside. In an envelope addressed to her old insurance company, my grandma left a letter confessing that she had deliberately set the fire to collect the insurance money. In her will, she even left the amount the insurance company had paid her. She had always been eccentric. She once burned the wings off her plastic nativity angels because, according to her, angels don't need wings. But I never realized how truly off she was until after she died. Story 3. My great-grandfather was adopted, but his adoption was covered up by making it seem like he was the baby that had died. For years, the family tried to maintain the illusion, but there were too many inconsistencies. Strange records about his birth, discrepancies in school and church documents, and the fact that he was the only one of 5 siblings without a middle name or a baptismal sponsor. After digging into our ancestry, I discovered that my great-great-grandmother had given birth to another baby who died very young from smallpox. My great-grandfather was actually born to a young Ojibwe woman who also passed away from the same disease. My great-great-grandparents secretly adopted him and even gave him their deceased baby's birthday, making him pretend to be a year older than he really was. His surviving siblings never wanted anything to do with him, or us. The truth finally came to light when I took a DNA test and started tracing our ancestry. I eventually found his adoption records through the Children's Aid Society. Crazy. Story 4. My grandma got married and had a baby in the early 1940s in Kansas when she was still a teenager. The father of the baby left when the child was only 1 or 2 months old. Her own father forced her to give up the baby and had the marriage annulled. No one in the family ever knew that my grandfather was actually her second husband or that she had a child before. Fast forward to the preparations for my grandma's 95th birthday. My aunt was working on genealogy research and unexpectedly found the birth certificate of my grandmother's first child. She went to my grandma and asked, "Mom, did you have a son when you were younger?" My grandma simply responded, "Yes, I did, and I miss him very much." They managed to track down my newly discovered uncle, who had spent much of his life searching for his birth mother without success. He had finally given up hope of ever finding her. By then, he was a retired Air Force pilot. He and his daughter came to my grandmother's birthday celebration, and when they hugged for the first time, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. He got to have a mother for 3 years before she passed away. Story 5. My great-grandfather essentially bought my great-grandmother when she was just 12 or 13 years old. He paid her father several $1,000s in the early 1930s in the U.S. for the privilege of marrying a preteen who was 20 years younger than him. He impregnated her immediately, then moved away with her. A few years later, he kicked her out, but kept their 2-year-old daughter. Her crime? She had dared to talk to a neighbor out of loneliness. He threatened that if she ever tried to come back for their daughter, the child would pay the price. He went on to raise my grandmother, telling her that her mother had abandoned her for no reason. The truth only came out when a DNA test linked my brother to a woman who turned out to be my grandmother's half-sister. Their mother, the woman my great-grandfather had discarded, had lived to be 98 years old. On her last day, she was still talking about how much she wished she could have held her little girl just one more time. Story 6. This wasn't exactly a family secret, but it was definitely an unusual situation. For nearly 2 years, my mom never told me that my girlfriend at the time was the daughter of a man she had almost married before I was born. The only reason she finally told me was because my girlfriend and her father had a bad relationship, and he decided to spread rumors online when he found out we were dating. He claimed that I was actually his brother's son and that my girlfriend and I were cousins. But everyone, including his own brother, knew that was complete nonsense. Even he admitted he wasn't in the right state of mind. Not to mention, I'm practically an exact replica of my father, so there was never any doubt about my actual parentage. The whole dispute got shut down quickly, but it was still weird enough that my mom felt the need to explain why it had even happened. It was a very strange time for my teenage brain. Story 7. My great-great-grandmother wasn't half Native American. She was actually half black. There are relatively small generational gaps in my family, so she lived long enough for me to meet and remember her. She passed away when I was 5. I still recall how fascinated I was by her darker, golden-toned skin. I also have golden-toned skin, and she was the only other person in my family who did, though mine isn't quite as dark as hers was. When I was little, I asked my grandma, her granddaughter, about it. She told me that my great-great-grandmother's mother had been an Indian who died when she was still young. My grandma was incredibly proud of this. Fast forward to when I was 25. I was talking to my wife about how my grandfather, on the other side of my family, had never been told about his true heritage, and now everyone who could have given him answers was gone. We also have an unusual last name, so I thought it would be interesting to trace my ancestry. My wife decided to order me a DNA kit. When the results came back, I had 0 Native American ancestry. Instead, I had enough African ancestry to confirm that my great-great-grandmother was actually half black. I told my grandma, and she was not happy. I've since learned that this kind of thing was common in my great-great-grandmother's time. In our area of the country, it was more socially acceptable to claim Native American ancestry than it was to acknowledge black heritage. Story 8. Thanks to Ancestry, I found out that I almost dated my half-brother. So my parents were very social people, potheads, and we always had a lot of people coming and going from our house. One particular group of friends was a really cool Southern rock band. They would often come over, bringing their kids, and we kind of grew up together. Fast forward to when I was 16. One of the older boys, we'll call him John Smith, whom I had always thought was cute, yeah, I know, gross in retrospect, was always really nice to me. At the time, I had just broken up with my boyfriend after he cheated on me, and I needed a date to a school dance. As a bit of revenge, I thought it would be great to show up with an older, handsome guy, so I asked John to go with me. My mom was really hesitant. She kept making excuses, saying he was too old for me, he was 19, that he smoked, that he was a bad influence, etc. I didn't know at the time, but she even begged him not to let anything happen. In the end, we still went together. It was all for nothing, though. We danced, he played the role well since he knew I was just trying to make my ex jealous, but I never really felt a spark. In the end, it was just like going with a good friend I had grown up with. Fast forward to Christmas 2019. My husband bought me a DNA test, and by January I was excited to get the results. But then, something weird happened. None of my cousins on my dad's side showed up. Instead, I had a whole list of Smiths, including one person listed as a half-sibling. I immediately recognized her as John Smith's sister. At this point, I was beyond confused. Both my mom and dad had already passed away, so I reached out to my mom's sister. She confirmed that my mom had cheated on my dad. A lot, especially with 2 of the guys from the band I grew up around. She blamed it on my dad cheating too, and the fact that both of them had drug problems when they were younger. I was absolutely furious. My mom had died when I was 18, and I had grown up with this complex believing my dad never really loved me. And yet no one thought to tell me this? Did my dad even know? I'm pretty sure he did. I never looked much like my supposed siblings, but it turns out I actually have 6 more siblings on my biological father's side. Papa was a Rolling Stone. One of them looks exactly like me. Here's the other kicker. I had actually gone to my biological father's funeral a year before this. At the time, I went just to support John Smith, since we were still close. So in the same year, I unknowingly watched both of my fathers be buried. Family secrets are the worst. Looking back now, I am beyond grateful that nothing ever happened between me and John. That could have been an absolute nightmare. Also, to all the family members suddenly crawling out of the woodwork saying they suspected all along, screw you. Story 9. My thrice great-grandfather was always said to have been a German sea captain, who purchased my thrice great-grandmother from a Tsimshian tribe in northern British Columbia before they settled on an island in Washington. Eventually, they had to move to the mainland, right before mixed-race couples were forced out. Fun times, I'm sure. This was a well-known story in our family. Then we found an old local history book. Turns out my great-great-great-grandfather wasn't exactly the legendary captain we thought. He was actually a deserter from a ship who did purchase a native woman. But here's the twist. It wasn't my great-great-great-grandmother, Jenny. He actually purchased a woman named Mary. Mary didn't want to leave her tribe unless her sister Jenny came with her. So both women left together. Eventually, they both started having children with him. Then at some point, Mary left to return to her tribe, leaving Jenny behind to be the nominal mother of all the kids. Now the family has had to figure out how exactly to draw the family tree. Story 10. Last week, I was talking with my dad and stepmom and finally revealed how I hacked. Their words, not mine. I didn't actually hack anything. The family computer password after they had locked it. So when I was a teenager, my dad and stepmom would lock the computer whenever they were at work. But I liked to surf MySpace and later Facebook when I was supposed to be doing schoolwork. To keep me off, they set up a password. Unfortunately for them, their password skills were about as strong as a wet paper bag. My dad's first attempt? His first initial and last name, ironically also my name, since I'm a junior. That was easy. When they changed it, it was just a combination of my stepmom's initials and my dad's initials. Then they capitalized the initials. It just went on like this. Weak passwords that were incredibly easy to guess. Finally, my grandpa recommended this USB device that would lock the PC unless it was plugged in. Seemed like a good idea, except I figured out how to bypass it in a few minutes. There was a 30-second inactivity window upon restart. So I would simply restart the machine, press Ctrl-Alt-Delete, open the task manager, find the locking program, and shut it down right before it could start. The computer never locked. When I was done, or if they got home early, I would just restart the computer and let it lock as normal. They knew I was getting onto the computer but couldn't figure out how. And they never asked me. They just assumed I was some kind of hacker. Ironically, if they had asked, I would have told them. So here I am, 13 years later, visiting them and my grandma, and they bring up how I always hacked their computer. I finally broke the news that it was just weak passwords and basic knowledge of Windows programs. Now I'm actually studying cybersecurity, hoping to eventually get a job in penetration testing. Funny how things turn out. Story 11. This wasn't necessarily a spilled secret since it was never confirmed. But here goes nothing. My great-grandma, God bless her, had a really hard life. She grew up working as a maid for a wealthy family. She always wondered why they took her in, because despite making several mistakes, they never fired her. She also told me that her own mother had died when she was young, so she ended up staying with that family. Years after my great-grandma passed, my mom told me something that made me rethink everything. My great-grandma's mother was never the most loving parent, and after she passed away, another maid from the rich family took care of her while she was working. This maid basically raised her like her own daughter. My grandma once mentioned that one of the men in that household had suddenly left the country. After hearing that, my mom had a theory. What if she was actually the daughter of that family? What if that man had an affair with the maid, got her pregnant, and the family wasn't heartless enough to abandon them? Instead of publicly acknowledging the child, they quietly gave her to another woman to raise. But that woman didn't live long either. The more we talked about it, the more sense it made. Even my grandma admitted that it could be true. My mom suggested taking a DNA test to confirm it, but my grandma shut it down immediately. By that time, my great-grandma had outlived the wealthy family, but my grandma knew her sons would make a huge fuss just to try and get money out of it. So she took the truth to the grave. Years later, my mom only told me and one other relative, the only daughter who wouldn't make a big deal out of it. We were all pretty shocked because the theory actually made a lot of sense, but we'll never truly know. Story 12. My grandma never wants anyone to talk about it, but on my family's LeBlanc side, we have a dark family secret. That branch of our family tree came from Canada, but according to my grandma, they originally fled from France right after Napoleon was exiled. Supposedly, one of our ancestors, several generations back, was his cousin, and our original surname was actually Bonaparte. They had been living the noble life, but after Napoleon's exile, people started getting rid of the remaining Bonapartes. Fearing for their lives, our ancestors fled to Canada, changed their last name to LeBlanc, one of the most generic names possible, and completely reinvented themselves. It sounds far-fetched, but when I started doing ancestry research, I found a hard stop on our LeBlanc lineage. No immigration records, no parentage, nothing to trace back, just a sudden appearance in Canada. Every other branch of my family tree can be traced back at least 200 years further than the LeBlancs. Could be a coincidence, could be poor record keeping, or my grandma could be telling the truth. Just don't tell her I told you. She's very serious about keeping it hidden. Story 13. In the early 1980s, my family abandoned my aunt when she was just 20 years old, sending her to a state-run mental institution in the South. They never visited her, not once, until she passed away last year. It was a similar situation to what happened with the Kennedy family, but this wasn't some outdated norm from 100 years ago. She had a severe mental disability, but she was still able to communicate. She recognized and acknowledged people, though her speech was limited. The saddest part? My family donates to multiple charities for intellectual and developmental disabilities. They publicly act like they care about these issues, yet they had no problem throwing away their own family member. Given that no one ever checked in on her, I can only imagine the kind of treatment she received at that institution. It wasn't until after she passed that I even learned she existed. I asked one of my aunts about her history, and the realization hit me. No one ever cared. They left her there to be forgotten. Story 14. Y'all ready for this trashy ride? A few years ago, when 23andMe was all the rage, my mom's twin sisters, she's one of 6 siblings, both took the test. Turns out, they had different fathers. Here's what happened. One night, my grandmother went to a concert. Apparently, she caught the eye of the lead singer. One thing led to another, and she ended up on a tour bus. Well, this guy wasn't the sharing type, except when it came to group activities. My grandmother apparently wasn't too picky either. 9 months later, twins. No one is quite sure who in the family came forward with the story. Most likely my oldest uncle, since he eventually became friends with the singer. Imagine that conversation. Looking back, it all makes sense. Physically, the twins are total opposites, aside from both being Caucasian. One's overweight with brunette hair, the other, skinny and the only redhead on that entire side of the family. One loves a rainy night and rabbits. The other doesn't. That was a hint. At the time, my mom was the youngest. My grandfather divorced my grandmother, and she went on to have the twins, sired by 2 different men on a tour bus on the same night. She eventually married one of the guys and had another kid with him. That kid grew up to go to prison, for the 4th and final time, for stabbing my oldest uncle. Story 15. I never grew up with a father, just me and my 4 siblings. My younger brother had a different dad, but he wasn't around either. My dad, though, he lived down the street. I would see him drive by with his new wife or girlfriend. I'd be playing in the yard, waving excitedly. "There goes my dad," I'd tell my friends, proudly. I don't know why. Years later, when I was 23, my aunt told my wife that my real dad was looking for me. I brushed it off. I told my wife my aunt was just trying to start drama. She should mind her own business. But the thought lingered. It made sense. My dad had always been cold. Then when I was 37, I came home from work, grabbed a beer, and told my wife I needed some time to unwind. I sat in my man cave. The phone rang. I looked up at the TV where the caller ID was displayed. It was his name. I froze. My wife answered the call, then knocked on the door. "No, it's your dad." I was speechless. When I picked up the phone, he was talking fast, probably afraid I was going to hang up. I told him to calm down. We talked for a while. Then he said, "I need to get home, but please answer when I call. Your brothers and sisters would love to talk to you." I promised him I would. A little while later, he called again. I spoke to my 15-year-old brother, my 8-year-old brother, my 12-year-old sister. Turns out my dad had been searching for me since I was 23. At one point, he had found a phone number. He built up the courage to call. A woman answered. She told him, "Leave him alone. He wants nothing to do with you." He's a man now. He doesn't need you. To this day, we have no idea who that woman was. Heartbroken, he gave up. He stopped searching until he was 37, when his new wife encouraged him to try again. I lost all those years. When I confronted my family, no one denied he was my real dad. Not my mom, not my siblings, not my uncles or aunts. Everyone knew, everyone, except me. I spent the next 9 years building a relationship with him. It was great. We swam in the river together, spent time with my half-siblings, and for the first time, I forgot that I was already an adult. Then in January, COVID took him. I don't regret opening up to him. I don't regret the time we had. But I do regret all the years that were stolen from us. And whoever answered that phone call years ago, I'll never forgive them. And here's the last twist. I run a successful business. I built it from the ground up, under the last name of the man I thought was my father. I took so much pride in that name. But now, it's not even my real name. I feel like I should change it, but it's already so well known. I don't know what to do. Story 16. A few years ago, my mom bought my fiancé and me 23andMe DNA tests for Christmas. She had become obsessed with researching her entire family tree. I'm talking about buying poster boards, cutting and pasting pictures of people, drawing lines to connect the lineage. She had even traced our side of the family back several generations to the Italian mafia. Pretty neat, actually. Anyway, right off the bat, I got a match with someone I didn't recognize, but we shared a significant amount of DNA. I brought it to my mom since she had the big poster board, but she didn't recognize the name either. That meant it had to be from my dad's side. At this point, just over 2 years ago, I had cut contact with my dad, so I wasn't about to ask him about it. Instead, I sent a message to the woman who appeared as a close relative. After going back and forth for a few days, we finally figured out a name in common: my grandmother. Turns out, my grandmother had an affair with this woman's father a month before he got married to her mother. That meant this woman was actually my biological aunt. She only lived a couple of hours away, and we met once. She was a very nice lady. This totally explained why my grandmother treated me horribly my entire childhood. Despite being the only one in my generation to accomplish anything and not fall into substance abuse, I was still the one she resented the most. Turns out, I was the living proof of her infidelity. Also, 6 months later, my adopted fiancé got a match as well. He finally made contact with his biological mother, father, and brother. Story 17. My father died when I was 8 years old. For most of my life, I was told it was from natural causes. But the truth is, he died due to blunt force trauma. He used to travel frequently to Germany for work and always carried an attaché case, a professional-looking rectangular bag. Unfortunately, he had some bad friends. When he was on one of his trips, they attacked him, beat him badly, and stole the work bag. They also took his car, his bank account, I don't even know how that was possible, and possibly even a house he owned in Normandy. The head trauma destroyed him. He completely lost his mind after that, and over time, he turned to alcohol until it ultimately led to his death. But the real cause of everything was that initial attack. These so-called friends tricked my dad into signing a bunch of papers when he was mentally unstable, and that's how they took almost everything from him. To this day, my family avoids me like the plague. My mother never told me the truth, but I did my own research. My stepbrothers and my dad's friends stole all the money that was meant for my brother and me when we became adults. It makes me furious to think about, but at the same time, it feels good to finally share this anonymously. I'm French, so sorry if my English isn't perfect. Story 18. My stepdad had a secret daughter and nearly got charged with attempted murder because of it. When he was in his late 20s, he started dating a woman in his apartment complex. After a few months, she cut off all contact. Turns out she had gotten pregnant, but she was actually married and never told him. Her husband must have been painfully unaware because she managed to hide the pregnancy from him by claiming she had stomach cancer. When she gave birth, she left the baby in a dumpster. A janitor at the hospital found and rescued the child. A few days later, the woman came forward. My stepdad had no idea she had even been pregnant. He hadn't heard from her in almost a year. But as soon as he saw the baby, it was undeniable. She was his. He did everything he could to claim custody while having to go through a rigorous legal process to prove his innocence. He also had to take months of parenting classes and prove that he was capable of raising a child. Meanwhile, the story made national headlines and adoption offers started pouring in. But my stepdad is the kind of person who believes that family is family, and he was determined to get custody of his daughter from the state. The mother, by this point, was very much in jail. After a long battle, he finally got custody of his daughter. But at the same time, he was dealing with an impossible situation. He was in his late 20s, working a demanding on-call job, and his first wife had just abandoned their toddler son at the insistence of her new husband. He was living in a tiny apartment, working 65 hours a week, mostly overnight shifts, while trying to take care of 2 children under the age of 3, all on his own. Within a year, he realized he couldn't do it anymore. He made the heartbreaking decision to give his daughter up for adoption to a family that was very wealthy, lived in a great area, and had been unable to have children of their own. He even tried to negotiate staying in her life, but the adoptive family felt it would be best to raise her as their own. It devastated him, but he agreed, on the condition that she be told the truth when she was old enough. A few weeks after her 18th birthday, she found my stepdad. By then, he and my mom had been married for years. My mom had known about this from the beginning. At the time, I had never met her. My mom casually mentioned it one day, saying, "By the way, this is a thing that happened, and when you visit, your stepsister will be there too." Now, she and her adoptive mother, her adoptive father had passed away shortly before her 18th birthday, are very much part of the family. Sadly, my stepdad's son had a rough life. A few months after meeting his sister, he died of an overdose on his 25th birthday. I went back and read all the old articles about the case. The quotes in them were so purely him. Also, in typical fashion, he has spent the last 25 years turning down offers to appear on shows like Oprah and Ellen, as well as countless book deals. He never wanted fame. His only concern was making sure his daughter had the best life possible, even if that meant letting her go. Ironically, she has now taken on a big role in safe haven advocacy. She's kind of a typical mid-20s woman, and you can tell she enjoys the attention from the media. She even accepted a book deal, much to my stepdad's dismay. But at the end of the day, the work she's doing is a net positive, and he supports her completely. He's one of the most loyal, honorable people I've ever met. For him, doing the right thing is never complicated. He just does it. Life has thrown a lot of challenges his way, and while I always liked him, it was hard to truly see a stepdad as a parental figure when you meet them as a near adult. But after learning about what he went through, I realized that every kind thing he ever did for me growing up had nothing to do with trying to win me over or make my mom happy. He did them because it was simply the right thing to do. My biological dad is a good man, and I love him, but my stepdad is the one who truly showed me what it means to be selfless. He never preached it or tried to teach it. It was something I learned just by watching him. Story 19. I'm not sure how much of a family secret this was at the time, but it was definitely news to my generation when I found out last year. My bitter, reclusive aunt, who refuses to talk to my mom because she's close with her stepfamily, actually has a very specific reason for it. Turns out my aunt was the other woman in my uncle's marriage, her own stepbrother. When they divorced, he didn't choose my aunt. Instead, he moved on quickly and married someone else. They've been happily married ever since, while my aunt ended up marrying a violent alcoholic. She's still a prejudiced, mean-spirited person, but after learning all of this, I can't help but feel a little sorry for her. On top of that, between my biological grandmother's passing and my grandfather meeting my step-grandmother, it turns out he most likely fathered a son from a one-night stand. That means I have an uncle out there somewhere that I've never met, and most of the family hasn't either. It's not something that gets talked about. The only time his existence was even mentioned was when my grandfather passed away and the topic of inheritance came up. As far as I recall, one of my aunts tried reaching out to him, but unsurprisingly, he wanted nothing to do with us. Thank goodness the other side of my family is far less complicated. Story 20. After reading through this thread, I've come to the conclusion that those over-the-top soap operas on TV aren't nearly as far-fetched as people think. The truth really is stranger than fiction. When I was 16, I finally started piecing together where my life actually began. I remember seeing a framed picture of my parents' marriage certificate and doing the math. It didn't add up. As I got older, I started to notice that my mother was extremely strict, especially when it came to me being out unsupervised, being around boys, or staying out after dark. My parents were harsh in general, but especially with me. I still remember standing in the doorway of my bedroom while my mom stood in the hallway. I had just figured out that she got married in April, but I was born in October, which meant she was already pregnant when they got married. By the time I realized this, I was the oldest of 5 kids. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I do remember blurting out something along the lines of, "That's why you hate me so much." The look on her face was one I had never seen before. Utter shock. It was like she hadn't even considered the possibility that I would figure it out. She was completely unprepared for that moment. Growing up, she had always treated me differently from my siblings. She was especially hard on me. constantly rejecting me, acting like I owed her something. She never once told me she loved me. If a friend's mom was kind to me, gave me attention, doted on me, or even offered me something I desperately needed, like shoes, my mother would instantly shut it down. She couldn't stand seeing me receive even the smallest bit of kindness from anyone. I spent years trying to earn the love I never got. I got good grades, stayed out of trouble, took care of my siblings, cooked, cleaned. None of it made a difference. I grew up believing I was worth nothing. That led to emotional issues, eating disorders, and worse. If I ever spoke up about the things I knew were wrong in our house, I was silenced, quickly and brutally. When I was 15, my parents' marriage started falling apart. My dad separated us. He sent me and my sister to our maternal grandmother's house, while he took my 3 younger siblings to his parents' house just a few blocks away. At the time, I had this overwhelming feeling that things were shifting in a way that would seal my fate. I didn't understand why, but I felt like I was grieving the person I could have been if I had just been loved. Looking back, I was so lucky that I ended up at my grandmother's house. For the next 4 years, she gave me the love, warmth, and acceptance I had never received. I soaked it up like someone dying of thirst. It didn't fix everything. Therapy, distance, and time did that. But it did give me a reference point. My grandmother showed me what it really meant to love a child. When I became a parent myself, that's what I drew from. I can't imagine what would have happened to me without her. It was like God threw me a lifeline at the last possible moment. Years later, I found out even more. My mother had been raised by a rigid, proud 1950s housewife. She was only 17 when she got pregnant. My dad took her on a date to Griffith Park in Los Angeles late at night. She was inexperienced, had no real knowledge of S, and to this day, she claims my dad forced himself on her. She felt violated and ashamed, but no one in her family cared. When she got pregnant, my grandmother was so mortified that she threw her out of the house. My mom had nowhere to go, so she had to live with my dad's parents instead. That wasn't great either. My dad's family had their own issues. My aunts told me that he was such a troublemaker growing up that their mom had to quit her job just to stay home and keep him under control. Years later, my mom was diagnosed with depression, fibromyalgia, severe mood disorders. The list goes on. It made sense. She had a reputation for being an emotional wreck, and honestly, she was miserable to be around. She yelled a lot, and when she did, my dad would lash out at us. That, combined with the constant presence of church in our lives, seemed to be the only parenting strategy they had. On the outside, we looked like the perfect little family. Behind closed doors, it was pure misery. And my dad? He wasn't normal either. I truly believe he was born with some kind of neurological issue. He never understood boundaries, and his behavior over the years reflected that. It led to scandals. Major scandals. He's currently on his 5th wife. Some of the past scandals involved his stepdaughter, but I won't even go into that. His current marriage is rocky, but now that they're older, they're trying to work things out, probably because neither of them wants to grow old alone. My parents have somewhat calmed down. My mom has at least acknowledged a few of her mistakes, though my dad remains oblivious. Ironically, there's a best-selling teen novel based on some of the trauma in my family. The author went to school with my brother and apparently drew from what he went through. My brother is my closest sibling, and he suffered worse than I did. He's experienced more trauma than almost anyone I've ever met. He finally got sober, but the damage was already done. He's an amazing person, brilliant, kind, always helping others. But his children are now dealing with the struggles that come from having an alcoholic parent. That's how the cycle continues. At the end of the day, we can spend forever pointing fingers at the ones who hurt us. But in the end, we're all human. The real work is breaking the cycle. Healing, restoring, that's what actually matters now. Story 21. My grandfather wasn't my mom's biological father. When I was in 7th grade, we had to do a school project on our ancestry, which required looking at our birth certificates. When I saw my mom's maiden name, I was completely confused. That's when my mom made me promise not to tell my grandfather that I knew. She said it would break his heart. Apparently, her biological father had wanted to marry my grandmother, but she turned him down. She had serious struggles with addiction and mental health issues, and despite his efforts, she wouldn't commit. In 2011, my mom was in a coma, dying from cancer. My grandfather stayed by her side. One day, with tears in his eyes, he told me that when he first met my mom as a little girl, he knew immediately that he had to marry my grandmother, because my mom needed stability and a father in her life. That was the first and last time he ever spoke about not being her biological father. After he passed away in 2020, the topic somehow came up. And it turned out neither of my mom's sisters had ever known the truth. The sad part? My mom took care of him throughout her life, and after she passed, that responsibility fell to me, since neither of my aunts wanted to be bothered. I took care of him gladly. He was more of a father to me than my biological dad ever was. He taught me what love really looked like. Story 22. My father once told me that I was supposed to have a little brother, but my mother had a miscarriage, and she never wanted my older sister, who was 4 at the time, or me, who was 2, to ever find out. 2 years later, we had another sister, but the miscarriage was a secret my mother intended to take to the grave. I only found out because my dad, who has been divorced from my mom for 20 years, came to visit my daughter for the first time a few weeks ago. She was born just before the pandemic, but due to a medical condition, my stepmother made it impossible for him to visit. Since she passed away from COVID, my dad was finally able to come see us in person. My mother still doesn't know that I know. My 2 sisters have no idea either. I'm not sure if I should ever bring it up. I don't think it's a huge deal, and my mother shouldn't feel any shame about it. But I also understand that it's a sensitive subject, especially since she was apparently pretty far along in the pregnancy. I also found out that my great-grandfather, during the Great Depression, while working on the railroads in Chicago, the police refused to investigate because my family were immigrants, and racism was rampant at the time. We will never know who did it, but we do know why. He was a somewhat wealthy immigrant, and someone wanted him dead for both of those reasons. Story 23. Mine is kind of dumb, not because it's actually a big deal, but because my family treated it like one for years. They kept this huge secret about my grandfather's brother, my great-uncle. Apparently, he was both gay and a huge pothead. I know, not exactly shocking by today's standards, but back in the day, it was a huge deal to them. My family acted like both of those things were equally scandalous. Uncle Dan, as we all called him, was an amazing guy. He loved cars. He even worked for an auto manufacturer. He was obsessed with baseball, and every year he'd buy my whole family tickets to our city's minor league games. He also got us season passes to the zoo for Christmas. He adored kids and was always taking care of them. He had even been married for a while and had a son, who later had a daughter of his own. But his marriage didn't last, for obvious reasons looking back. After his son moved out, he moved in with my great-grandmother, his mother, to take care of her in her old age. He stayed by her side for years, and she lived to be 89. They ended up passing away in the same year, just 3 months apart, both from cancer. I found out about his love for weed when I was a teenager, but unfortunately, we never got to share that experience together. After he died, my mom finally let it slip that he was also gay. It honestly made me sad. Not because he was gay, who cares? But because I realized he was never able to live his life the way he wanted. Even though my family never treated him poorly, they still made him hide that part of himself, and that alone is wrong. Looking back as an adult, I realized how much of his life was controlled by that secrecy. And even though it made total sense in hindsight, I was still shocked when I found out. I just wish I had known while he was alive, so I could have told him that none of it mattered to me, that I loved him exactly as he was. But life doesn't work that way. At least now, I like to think he's in some kind of afterlife, living in his dream weed garden, doing exactly what he wants, without judgment. And honestly, he deserves that. Story 24. From a young age, my brother and I suspected that our dad wasn't our biological father. Our parents always brushed it off, and by our late teens, we gave up asking. More than 20 years later, I received a friend request from a woman in Texas. At the time, I had a small following on YouTube as a craft personality, and since she was into knitting, I assumed she had found me through my tutorials. So I accepted. The next day, she sent me a message explaining that her stepfather was also my biological father, and my brother's. Her story checked out, and when I saw a picture of him, I knew she was telling the truth. I kept it to myself for a year and a half. I couldn't look my family or any of my relatives in the eye because I realized they had all been in on it. It turns out my mother had been married to this man and divorced him a year after I was born. She quickly met my dad, unless, of course, there had already been some infidelity. I'll never know. They got married 6 months later. My brother, who was 2 years older than me, had always been much more adamant as a child that something was off. He was 3 or 4 when it all happened, and I guess he remembered more than I ever could. When I finally decided to confront my parents, I booked a trip to meet my biological father. But before that, I went to my parents' house alone, planning to have dinner with them and tell them everything. I had already told the woman from Texas that I was going alone because my brother was emotionally fragile and might not react the same way I did. After dinner, I finally let the secret out. Of course, I became the bad guy. My now adoptive father told me, "The only person hurting from this is your mother, because you just stabbed her in the back." I expected that. They had convinced themselves they were in the clear forever. The next day, my mother convinced me that it wasn't fair to go alone and that I should cancel the trip and reschedule it with my brother. I gave in. When I finally told my brother, he flipped out. He couldn't understand why I had kept it from him for so long. But remember when I said he was fragile? He was very rural Midwest, abrasive, insecure to the max, and had about as much empathy and compassion as a hyena. A few years later, after deciding there was no one he could trust, he ended his own life. He left behind 2 young children and an ex-wife who was pure evil. It's messed up, but honestly, I think he's better off now. If he were still around, he'd probably be deep into some wild conspiracy theories, spiraling even further. It's been 10 years and I still haven't met the man. Story 25. This is old news to us now, but our paternal grandfather, the man behind our family name, is not actually our ancestor. Turns out our grandmother hated her husband. She went out of her way not to have his children, even seeking early 1900s abortions. Then she had an affair with a local married college professor. She got pregnant. When her husband passed away, his family assumed the baby was his. She didn't correct them. To cover her tracks, she drove across the country while 9 months pregnant, alone, so that her due date wouldn't match up. This was in the 1930s. She returned home. The family accepted the baby as part of their own, and she cut off all contact with the professor. She only admitted the truth on her deathbed. Honestly, it should have been obvious. The men in our family were typically 5 feet 6 inches and stocky. My biological father, over 6 feet tall and thin as a rail. Zero genetic resemblance. I'm curious if the professor's children ever had descendants. It would be incredible to meet new distant cousins, almost a century after the affair took place. Story 26. My brother is adopted. Once he had kids of his own, he felt the need to seek out his biological family, if for no other reason than to get some medical history. Turns out there had been a letter waiting for him from his birth parents. They had loved him deeply but weren't in a place to raise a child at the time. They were both in college when he was born. The crazy part? His parents stayed together. They eventually got married and had more children, so my brother has 3 full-blooded siblings. He reached out to his biological father and met up with him for coffee. The conversation was polite, but at the end his father said, "It was nice to meet you, but please don't contact us again." Apparently his wife had always struggled with the decision to give him up, and seeing him again would be too much for her. The other kids didn't even know he existed. The real kicker? This is a relatively famous family in our area. I was able to look them up online. One of his brothers has multiple pictures posted, and it's like looking at my brother in a mirror. It breaks my heart that he'll never get to meet them or introduce his kids to their cousins. Another twist? Despite growing up completely separate, my brother and his biological family have so much in common. They pursued the same sports, the same fields of study. It's wild how genetics work. Story 27. I'll start by saying my uncle was never exactly a good person, but he loved me and my cousins more than anything. He was a heroin addict, and we often smoked together. At one point, when he was homeless, he managed to weld together 3 single-room campers and a school bus to create a makeshift home. Since it was winter in Ohio, he installed a wood-burning stove to keep warm. At the time, I was 15 and living with my aunt, his ex-wife. She allowed me to stay with him for a few nights. My uncle had a pig that someone had given him, which he kept in a small pen outside. He had even dug a pit to roast it in. One night, while we were playing cards, an old native man, let's call him Kenny, stopped by. Something about Kenny made me uneasy from the start. We had a generator outside in a shed that we only used occasionally for charging phones and basic electricity. For a few nights, Kenny would come over and we'd play cards, smoke, and hang out. But something always felt off about him. One night, while I was outside chopping wood for the stove, Kenny came outside. My uncle was still inside, probably using. Kenny walked up to me and told me how much he enjoyed spending time with me. But the way he said it, it felt wrong. It wasn't the way an adult talks to a teenager. It felt predatory. A few nights passed and Kenny hadn't come by. Then one night, I woke up to the fire being out. I went outside to the shed to grab more wood. While I was out there, I swear I saw a figure standing in the woods. This makeshift home was deep in the woods, completely isolated. I rushed back inside and woke my uncle. He grabbed a flashlight and went outside to look, but he didn't find anything. A few nights later, my uncle left to go into town. I stayed behind, tending to the generator and chopping more wood. That's when I heard a crunch behind me. I turned around. It was Kenny. He asked if my uncle was there. I told him no. Kenny said he'd wait with me. He started helping me chop wood, but the whole time he was staring at me. The way he looked at me made my skin crawl. We went inside after a while, and as time passed, things took a dark turn. Kenny tried to take advantage of me. Just then, my uncle walked in. He saw exactly what was happening. He grabbed Kenny and pulled him off me. I scrambled into a corner, shaking and crying. My uncle dragged Kenny outside. I heard yelling, fighting, a lot of noise. Then, silence. 2 hours passed before my uncle came back inside, covered in dirt. He looked at me and said, "You don't have to worry about Kenny ever again." He made me swear to never tell anyone what had happened. Years later, after he passed away, I finally told the family the truth. Story 28. My grandfather always bragged about putting his son through college, which frustrated my dad because he had actually worked his own way through school. He had earned both an Eagle Scout and an ROTC scholarship. He had also worked as the janitor of his fraternity house just to cover his room and board. For 40 years, my dad had resented that lie. Then at my cousin's outdoor wedding reception, the truth started unraveling. My great-aunt, my grandfather's little sister, was talking to my aunt, mentioning that a woman named LaTroya had passed away. My aunt immediately scolded her, saying she shouldn't call her that. Instead, she said the woman's real name, adding she was a nice lady. One of my cousins asked why she shouldn't call her LaTroya. That's when my aunt admitted, because it means the whore. Long story short, the recently deceased woman had been my grandfather's teenage sweetheart. But her father refused to let her marry him because my grandfather was a middle school dropout. So she married someone else, a well-educated mobster in Detroit. That mobster had survived scarlet fever as a child, but the illness had left him infertile. One night he was shot. It wasn't the police, it wasn't a mob hit, but whatever happened, it left his wife a widow. A few months later, she moved back to our town with her parents, and shortly after, she gave birth to a baby boy. Meanwhile, my grandfather had married his best friend's sister, started working 2 full-time jobs, and flipped houses on the weekends. The only time he ever stopped working was for Sunday Mass. He managed to buy a house, a cottage, and a beat-up pontoon boat. But when he passed away, he didn't leave behind much. That's when I started putting the pieces together. Looked up the name of the widow's son from her obituary. He had attended the University of Michigan. He had gone to law school. He had done very well for himself. And that's when I realized I was the only one who figured out which son my grandfather actually put through college. Story 29. We all thought my grandma was just mean, that she exaggerated tales of her evil stepmother and had a paranoid persecution complex. Years after she died, my mom was packing up to move, and we found a stack of letters and even a tape player with a cassette. It turns out her stepmother and half-sister were absolute nightmares, and her father just didn't notice or care. It was common practice at the time for widowers to basically ditch their young kids if the wife died and he remarried. So first the stepmother had her sent to a Catholic orphanage for schooling, and she only got to see her dad on rare occasions. Then the stepmother and half-sister sent a with deepest sympathy card to my grandma. On the back was a vicious letter saying they had heard my grandfather had left her and that she had best get on with her life and accept that she was worthless. My grandfather hadn't left. He had gone to fight in World War II. The half-sister later sent a formal invitation to her wedding, but inside was a handwritten note stating that my grandma was not actually allowed to come. It was a ploy to make sure their father didn't find out how cruel they were, while also giving them an excuse to complain about how terrible my grandma was for not even sending a gift. And it worked. The cassette was from when her half-sister started manipulating their 90-year-old father into not letting his daughter visit. My grandma had started recording for her own protection. On the tape, the half-sister claimed that my grandma had confused their father so much that he had sat outside in the winter for hours, waiting for her to come. It was a complete lie. After his death, they had his will expunged, claiming my grandma was a terrible daughter and that there was no way he had truly meant for the assets to be split. They argued that he must have been out of his mind when he wrote it and would have changed it if he could. A lawyer convinced my grandma she'd never win in court, and she lost about $500,000 in inheritance. It was awful. My grandma made so much sense after that. Story 30, that my aunt was actually my cousin. My aunt, her mom, gave birth to her when she was 13 years old. She then wrote to my grandmother telling her the child had died. But my grandmother was a smart woman, and she knew something wasn't right. She searched nearby orphanages and found my aunt's daughter. She recognized her immediately since they had lived with my grandmother for a brief time before this happened. My grandmother and grandfather went to the orphanage, retrieved my cousin, and brought her home. Instead of revealing the truth, they introduced her to my mother and her siblings as their new sister. They were poor and lived humbly, already struggling to feed their 7 children. But my grandmother said, "We don't give away family." I miss my grandmother. She was a wise, caring, and gentle woman. Story 31. My aunt had a baby in high school, and my grandma shipped her off to a nunnery about 2 hours away to carry out her pregnancy, deliver the baby, and put it up for adoption. My aunt begged to keep her daughter, but my grandma refused. Her aunt, my great-aunt, even offered to take the baby and raise her as their own, since they had only one child and couldn't have more due to fertility issues. But my grandma refused that too. The adoption was closed for my aunt, but open for the child, although she has never reached out. About 8 years ago, my parents told me the whole story. The craziest part? We live in a super small town of only 3,500 people, and while my mom technically doesn't know for sure, she strongly suspects she knows who the child is. She lives just a few country blocks from my grandma, and her adoptive mother has alluded to her being my aunt's daughter. She has the exact same birthday as the baby my aunt gave birth to, and they are identical. I actually ran into her a few years ago when I was working at a local diner, and it was eerie. She looked, sounded, and even had the same mannerisms as my aunt. Unfortunately, my aunt doesn't know and never will, because it was a closed adoption. What's even wilder is that this has never been brought up again. Not by my aunt, my grandma, or anyone else. The only reason my mom knows is because my dad told her. Still crazy to me. Story 32. I'm 34. I've basically always known that my maternal grandfather was married with 4 kids before he married my grandma. But I only found out the full story less than a year ago. What I didn't know was that he was a 30-year-old man with a wife and 4 kids when he started courting my then 15-year-old grandmother. Holy hell, not only was he abusive, but he was also a full-on creep. He died 5 years before I was born, and honestly, I kind of hate the guy. Oh, and when I was a teenager, we had this family get-together where my dad and his siblings introduced us to this woman in a way that felt weirdly formal, like it was some huge, profound moment. No one actually explained who she was, though, which made it even more confusing. It took a couple of years before my parents casually mentioned that she was their oldest sister. Turns out my paternal grandmother had a child out of wedlock. To this day, I still don't know if she was my paternal grandfather's daughter. Never saw her again either. The whole thing was just strange, and still is. Then again, my family's pretty weird in general, so I guess it's not all that surprising. Story 33. I, 37F, and my sister, 30F, organized an intervention for our alcoholic mother early last year. It did not go as planned. Instead of listening, she got defensive and decided to put my dad on the spot about a family secret they had been keeping for over 40 years. That's when my dad said, "Girls, you have a brother you don't know about." Turns out, before they got engaged, my parents had taken a break, and my dad had a summer fling. He had no idea the woman got pregnant until years later, when he was already married to my mom and had me. In 1984, he received a letter in the mail from the woman asking him to sign over parental rights to the child he never even knew existed. She wanted to marry someone who wanted to adopt the baby, and my dad, blindsided, signed the papers. My mom was devastated. That sadness festered and turned into resentment toward my father. Our entire childhood was shaped by that resentment. It didn't matter if we were there or not. She always put my dad down, and he just took it. He still does. They're still married, despite how miserable they are. Last year, we begged them to get a divorce, but they refuse. They don't want to spend money on lawyers. And during the intervention, my mom even said that if they did divorce, she'd come after everything they have. It's hard to even be around them. Story 34. My aunt, who passed away when I was too young to know her, was apparently in love with a Saudi prince when she moved there for work. They kept their relationship a secret for a while, but when his family found out, my aunt had to escape back to the Philippines. She had already given birth to their child, who is now one of my oldest cousins. Sadly, his mom died when he was a teenager, and my other aunt had to adopt him. That same aunt, this is all according to my mom, her sister, had another strange experience as a kid. One summer, she stayed with a distant relative, a great aunt I never met. This was in the 1970s. When she returned home to my grandma, her real mom, the family was confused when she started calling my grandma Tita, which means aunt in our language. Turns out the great aunt had slowly been brainwashing her, trying to convince her that she was actually her daughter. Thankfully, my aunt only went along with it when they were around. The moment they weren't, she called my grandma Mom, like always. Story 35. When my sister was 30 and I was 22, we drove home for Christmas. Out of nowhere, she announced that she had just found out our mother had used donor sperm to conceive her. We always knew she had a different dad, but we had assumed it was our mom's ex. Our mom swore she had told my sister about this at a more appropriate age, but judging by my sister's reaction, that was definitely not the case. I just remember driving along and my sister saying, "I cannot believe I am 30 years old and just now finding this out." We are a close family, so everything is fine now. In fact, this actually improved my sister's relationship with our dad, her stepdad. Our mom had carried a lot of shame about this. I don't think her mother, our grandmother, ever even knew. But honestly, it was a good experience for her. The moment we found out, we were supportive and admired her for being a bit of a trailblazer. She went after what she wanted in life, and we respect her for it. Story 36. During my freshman year of college, I found out I had a half-brother. One morning, I got an email from someone I didn't know. At my school, you could type in a name and get someone's email, so that's how she found me. She listed a couple of names and asked if they were my parents. Then she said that if they were, that meant we shared a half-brother on my mom's side. Naturally, I freaked out. How did a total stranger know my parents' names? And how did she know I had a half-brother before I did? I panicked and called my mom. She refused to talk about it over the phone and told me to wait until she got home from work. When she finally sat me down, she confirmed that I did have a half-brother. She had no contact with him and had never planned to tell me. And as if that wasn't shocking enough, I also learned that she had been married before meeting my dad, something I had never been told before. It was an incredibly long, stressful day, but the funny thing? That girl who sent me the email is now one of my best friends. We're not technically related, but it feels like we are, and I consider her family. However, my mom has no idea that we're close. It's all a little complicated,